Today we'd like to talk about API metrics and how does it matter in APIOps. A bit of myself. So I'm Ludovic Pourrat. I'm an API architect and API catalyst at Lombard group, and also being part of the platform team, so acting as a platform architect. And during my holidays, winter holidays and weekends, I'm also a ski instructor at the Swiss Snow School of Verbier. So let's present a bit Lombard. It's a private bank in Switzerland since 1796, quite a old one. We got main businesses in private clients, asset management, and technology for banking. Regarding that technology, we act as a financial software solution developer, meaning that we develop our own software to get a competitive advantage over the market. And what we do also is that we resell our platform as bank as a service to the bank. Few words about the platform. So we got 4 functional development streams: market, front, tax, and operation finance. And we got a quite modular service architecture, which composes around 800 components, which is quite huge. In terms of monetization program, we started in 2020 quite a large one, which target either functional and technical aspects. And the idea is to move towards a brand new platform based on OpenShift, leveraging GitOps and APIOps. And the idea being to migrate from GBoss running on VM to Spring Boot and Quarkus runtimes. We also support and develop micro frontend based on Angular. We develop against cloud, but I would say something that's as an start. So let's dive into the topic. So let me talk about API metrics. So the first metrics that matter and are the easiest one to start with are the performance metric, meaning that's what is the latency time for the API, what is the throughput regarding the API, what about you catch hit rate if you got some, and what about resource utilization your APIs needs to. And if we dive a bit more, it will be about reliability and availability metrics, meaning what is the uptime of your services, what are the error code and the error rate you may get. And this one, it's important to understand the type of error you are getting in terms of 500, but also in terms of authorization or authentication errors that may be suspicious and to look around. And starting from this, to an understanding about are you compliant with your ACLA, the one you get from your customers and with your customers. Then it's about security metrics together, is how your API are compliant to the OWASP top 10. So they just published in June this year some rules that are directly targeting the APIs. But also to figure out how about your API and your endpoint being authenticated and authorized properly, and to feed that with a rate limiting to protect your overall ecosystem. Something that is important to me is about the developer and the consumer experience metrics you may get, meaning what about your engagement rate or your API or your adoption, how long they get retention, but also the churn rate, meaning how many, I would say, customers are moving out of your APIs. But also, how about the quality of the documentation and the coverage for such. And which is important is a validation error rate. How many 400 errors do you got in your sandbox and or your development environment? If you don't get any, maybe you don't validate against schemas and you get maybe 2 more, it's maybe because your documentation is not well up to date. On the change management metrics, the idea will be to focus on understanding about the adoption and the retention, but also is your deprecation policy being effective? If you plan to deprecate V1, for instance, in 6 months, but what about if 1 month before your deadline, you still have 80% of your consumers being consuming that one? So something really important to gather and to oversee. But also, what about the version being used and your sunsetting? And also about if you get generated SDKs, how they're being used and which are the version being used in your ecosystem. Then on the standard and conformance metric, the idea will be to see how much your APIs are conformance to the standards, whatever it is, OpenAPI, GraphQL, Async API, or gRPC. But also, if you written your own standard in your company, maybe you would like to see how much your rules are being followed in your APIs. On the data governance, which is something important, there is some metrics which are key, which is about the data classification of your API. Is it secret? Is it confidential? Is it internal, public? And also on the privacy, what about the data exposure your APIs are in terms of GDPR or other regulation? And also about the data quality. Is your API is a source of truth, meaning the owner of data, or is it an API that processes data for someone else? And finally, last but not least, that's something that we will have all to think about, is that how your API are readiness in terms of usability from AI, bots, and LLM point of view. And so this is something we will have to figure out if we would like our APIs to be consumed that way. Let me present now the landscape that we've discovered and to focus on different metrics. So on the performance and reliability one, either you get metrics from your API gateways, but we think that OpenTelemetry is much more powerful in that respect to give you a real, let's say, metrics on how your API behave in that respect. On the security side, OWASP has been mentioned, that is key, but you get 42 Crunch or No Name that provide very good assessment and metrics on how your API are secured. But newcomers like Tribble and Escape, which can provide an assessment of how your OpenAPI and GraphQL endpoints, I would say, behaves in terms of security. And so I will encourage you to have a look. In terms of developer experience metric, the portal, the telemetry will give you a error rate mentioned above, but Milkrox is capable to, if you upload the spec, to give you a score and to qualify how much samples or documentation are in your spec, and to provide then you a good idea on how it is usable from a developer point of view. If we move on the change management metrics, bump.sh and Optic provide services for you to compare two versions of the spec and to oversee what are the changes, but whether those are breaking one, and to get good qualification about the changes. And Milkrox again, which is capable to do contract testing, will be in position to check whether your new release of the contract is still compatible with the existing test. And then if we move on the standard and conformance metric, then we leverage Spectral to check the rule and the API against our rules. And API Insight, which is an open source done by Cisco, is capable to aggregate those and provide you a metrics about how your spec is conformance to a standard. On the data governance, we leverage again Spectral to check the data qualification and some of the data that may be, I would say, not available to certain exposure. And we also Talent, which is a data catalog technology, which then provide, that's the way we can gather all those metrics about the data qualification, for instance. And on the AI readiness and usability, Lombard just provided a new online service to get a feedback about how your OpenAPI is compatible and ready to be consumed by ChatGPT, for instance. So let me have a look now and discuss about those API metrics and how can be applied to APIOps and what are the benefits. If we start from the design phase, definitely the developer experience metric will have to be fetched and to oversee and to review maybe whether we are conformant, and that's where we will need to adapt our design and our spec. When developing, we will need to get feedback from whether our API is still backward compatible, and maybe to review the custom rules we applied to check against the code against the business rules. On the security side, the OWASP assessment is pretty key, but also to review the data governance metric, meaning maybe to say that those API must not expose that kind of data in that particular zone. At deployment, you will need to figure out your performance metric in order to plan the resource utilization and then to do some capability management. On the publication, nothing to do yet. Maybe we'll cover that later on. And then when you will be monitoring, the idea that you will be refine your metrics, the way you collect them, maybe to review the quality and to add a few more and to get better and better in that one. And when you will be analyzing all the metrics, this is where you can put some focus and prioritization on your work, meaning that you will be getting from your topmost APIs the topmost concerns, and then you can decide what needs to be done along your next development cycles. So we described the kind of metrics you can fetch, but then and we see that there is many sources. So let me talk about the API specification overlay. So if we start from the market readiness, we see that there is not yet a single product that can provide you and gather all the API metrics you may need. And the problem is that you may need to fetch those against multiple sources, and it may be then difficult to feed that back into the APIOps lifecycle. But we already have something we invested upon at the early beginning, which is the spec. So let's move into that solution driver. So the idea is that we will start from the spec, and we will reuse that something that exists, which are the API extension. The API extension will be somehow the placeholder for the metrics we would like to feed back into the spec. And to do so, we will reuse a concept that has already been described, which is the API overlay. And that overlay will be the way to patch the spec against the extension we've added, meaning to patch the spec to feed back the metrics we've collected. So let me present that to you. If you look on the top right, you will see a minimal spec with two metrics, the API conformance score and an API operation latency, meaning a get, for instance, on my resource, and we fetch that response time was 20 milliseconds. If we get that minimum computed overlay, then we can merge that into the final spec, and then we get from our Open API two metrics we can be gathered. We can do that for async API because it's YAML based, and for GraphQL, we did a kind of a trick is that we've put on top of the schema that will be presented in the spec a hint matter written in YAML, like the Open API and the Async API, just for us to have a seamless way to provide back those metrics. So we now have a way to carry on the metrics, but how to compute them? So in Lombard, we invested a year ago the idea that for us, the API specification and the API mock definition could be seen and must be seen as a custom resource definition in Kubernetes. So what we do is that at deployment, on test and prod, for instance, we will be creating, as the same way we deploy our component into Kubernetes, we'll be creating two new artifacts. the specification and the mock definition. Or in development, we created an APIOps controller that fetched that from our Git repo, and then that allowed the developer to maintain their specification and mock definition up to date to their commit. So once we get that specification, we've created an API developer controller that will take that specification and push that into developer portal, our developer portal, meaning that we switch from declarative point of view, we got a spec, and to an imperative point of view, we deploy that spec into our portal. And for the mock, we have an API sandbox controller that get that mock definition and then create a mock for us behind our sandbox. So we automated that way from the spec and the mock how we would like them to be deployed either on the portal or on the sandbox. Okay, so we got the spec. And remember that we said that it's a good starting point. So starting from that spec, we created finally a metrics controller that is fetching from the different and various data sources. So from the OpenTelemetry, for microcs, for gathering the conformance score, and so on, to gather all those metrics, and then it writes back at the end an overlay. So that's the way along the day we can retrieve the metrics we have from that spec and to write it back into an overlay. So if we put that then all in the picture, once we got that overlay, we get that overlay and we push it back to the portal so we can then have a way to oversee the metric that has been computed. And because we are capable to fetch the latency time for our API operation, then we can enrich our mock definition with microcs to get, I would say, accurate mock that behave exactly the same like in dev, test, and prod. And if you look on the portal at the end, we display the API. You click on the card, it flips, and then you can see the metrics we gathered from a given API. So, and that's a give for developers, product owners, anyone who are interested with the services they offer to the rest of the company, the quality of the metrics they got. So from an overview of the overlay, it starts with artifacts that are stored in Git. We create then the specification and the mock definition in custom resource definition in Kubernetes. Then we have a controller that fetch the metrics starting from that spec and write it back into an overlay. And the overlay is being fetched to enrich the API definition in the portal and to get better behaving mock on the sandbox. If we recap about the process, so the API specification is the source of truth, and here's the way to compute the metrics against the various sources. Then the overlay is the placeholder to carry on all the metrics. And that overlay can be fed back into your APIOps lifecycles along your iteration. At the end, all the organization can benefit for all the metrics you've collected. And for us, we think that the sweet spot is to display back that into the portal and to recap that into the spec, because that's the one everyone understands and knows about. So finally, a few words about the maturity metrics on API metrics. So at first, it's good to start with the fundamentals, meaning to focus on performance metrics. Then once you understand your top most important APIs, maybe is to overview the security against and to start documenting those APIs. Then to deep dive by idea of conformance, check against your consumer and developer experience. Then to think of the data governance metrics and your reliability and availability metrics. And finally, as an optimized view, to continuously monitor those and to think about the maturity model you have against and the complexity model you have against chatbot consumption. So thank you. I wish you some happiness at Apidays. And remember that better skiers have more fun.